try again. I don't go out to clear ahead, or maybe I'll just give up. Oh no, that's styrofoam. But I finished reading Our Inner King a couple days ago by Franz Waal. I think he's extraordinary. I read Bonobos, You've Forgotten Me earlier this year, and was just amazed. Just fell in love with it. I gave it as a gift to like multiple people. I bought myself a copy. I went and got all of Franz Waal's, or a bunch of Franz Waal's books at Howard last year. So I'm just like so taken by Bonobos, by the way that he wrote about them, by the photography of them, and he kind of writes how bonobo society and bonobo culture is, so bonobos are equidistant evolutionarily to us as chimpanzees are. So bonobos and chimpanzees are equidistant to us evolutionarily. And we know a lot about chimpanzees. We've had research on them for a long time. We have a lot of Jane Goodall's research that was so extraordinary. And kind of what their research, their observations, those studies show are that the chimpanzee shows a lot of really violent, aggressive, cutthroat tendencies, practices, kind of cultural norms, that it is hierarchical, it's patriarchal, with dominant males, and who are kind of in control of the sexual relationships, and that they will be very aggressive, very violent towards other males, that they will show aggression towards females, that they have been observed practicing infanticide. They'll be very, very violent towards those considered outside of their social community, their social circle. And so this research, knowing that chimpanzees are our closest evolutionary relative, without consideration of bonobos, we kind of see within them a lot of our, what we would consider our worst attributes as human species. Our violence, our aggression, our capacity for cruelty, our hierarchical structures, our patriarchal structures. And because we see these attributes of our society reflected in chimpanzee society, we've come to kind of understand the worst parts of ourselves as fundamentally animalistic, and that the best parts of ourselves are unique to humans, and that much of that goodness, that capacity, comes from our intelligence, that we are uniquely intelligent species. So bonobos have been researched for a much smaller amount of time. They were considered pygmy chimpanzees. That's how they were kind of labeled or documented in zoos into the 20th century. And I don't think it was until the middle of the 20th century that scientists, with some scientists, or I'm sure there are specific names, I don't know, I can't recall, but specific scientists came to recognize that what was being named as chimpanzees were actually a separate species, bonobos, that have unique characteristics physically, but also socially and emotionally, relationally, and of all of these pieces. Pygmy chimpanzees were known, or at least individuals that are documented, were often recognized as like friendlier, as laughing and smiling in a way that was seemed very human, and that was not observed in chimpanzees. They're of a smaller stature. They have some larger features. And so when research started to expand on this species, scientists and researchers learned that this is a very specific species that lives within a very specific environment. I think it's 2 forests in Africa. I can't remember which country specifically. But it's a very small ecological environment, ecological niche that they have been discovered in, that they are studied in, and it's a ecology, an environment that is very fruitful. There is not a lot of competition for resources, and specifically for resources of the bonobos. And so it can generally be considered a pretty optimal environment where kind of they're able to, within the size of their populations, meet the fundamental needs of their kind and of their communities, that they have plenty of food and not any significant predators that kind of inhibit their ability to thrive, except for humans who destroy their environment. And so once research kind of expanded on bonobos, and they've been able to do these longer term studies, not just in zoos, but in their natural habitat. We've been able to, and a lot of this research is Franz to Waal and other scientists, specifically whose names I don't know, but that have been kind of cultivating and collecting this research, have recognized how distinct bonobos are as a species, and how much of that distinction, rather than in its physical form or in even observable kind of actions and relationships, but that so much of this distinction centers on how they relate socially and emotionally and how they build their communities. And a lot of this can really only be understood by tracking individuals within communities over time. And that level of like nuance and specificity and longevity is really hard. It just takes time and resources in order to get that kind of research. And so, but what that research has shown is that bonobos are a matriarchal society, very clearly dominated by females, and that is not egalitarian. It is not that females have gained power and are on equal footing with the males. It is that the females are dominant over the males, and that is not physically. Male bonobos are technically generally physically larger. They physically have the capacity to overcome, to kind of dominate over the female. Where this matriarchal structure is able to be so successful is in social relationships. So its societies are largely almost organized around, I guess, defined by sex. That one of the most obvious and some of the most shocking observations of bonobos, which inhibited a lot of the research being published and politicized research being published, even though it was not technically intended for political purposes, but that a lot of relationships are built around, center around, and are maintained through sex. So sex looks in some ways very different it serves an entirely different social function for bonobos. Part of this is that there's a whole lot of technical, I don't know if it's worth getting into all the details. There's a whole lot of like technical biological reasons. So in that, like, the females will have swollen vulva for, I think, like half the year, for very long periods of time, that is not associated with ovulation. So these enlarged genitalia are very attractive to the male. Are very attractive, and so bonobos are regularly having sex or some kind of sexual interaction with both male and females throughout the day. I think, if I remember right, technically it's the average length of interaction of sex is like 15 to 30 seconds. So very, very short. It's used often it's associated with breeding, in the way of that it has a kind of positive connotation, that it sort of is used to improve relationships. It also tends to sort of dampen conflict and negative feelings. It is used for resource distribution. It, like, socially serves all of these functions, essentially as a means to what I kind of think is just like overall heightening the positive interactions and of reducing the negative interactions. It's essentially an easy means to sort of negating some of the violence and the violent tendencies that we see in ourselves and that we see in chimps. So what this looks like is that, I guess, sort of, their communities look like are with females dominating. And how this happens are through the relationships that they build, are through the social ties. So that's where the sex comes in being able to build these social ties with both males and females, using sex as a means to improve these social ties. But it's also that the females within the community tend to function kind of unilaterally. So unlike in chimpanzees, where they'll see a lot of conflict between hierarchical levels, in an effort to achieve that dominant spot. The dominant female in the bonobos is not exclusively, but tends to be the oldest female in that community. And she gets prioritization of resources, of food. She's kind of the one to settle conflicts. And so if males, and the value of this, why would this happen evolutionarily? And it makes me think of the book, what is it called? Gate to Women's Country. Makes me think of Gate to Women's Country. It's super weird, which I recommend, but spoiler. It is kind of like, here's this women's country, and everything just like works. It's just a society. It's just a city. And then all the men go to be warriors, and they're all in the warrior palace, and that's all they do. Their whole life is to be a warrior. Then the men decide to go to war and try to go to war, and ultimately, like, of course, the women know they're not idiots, and they basically accidentally kill all the men that try to go to war, and they're basically like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, your lives are cared for. You don't have to do any work. You don't grow the food. Like, we're doing all the work. in order to have this world of peace. And you want to dominate for dominance's sake without actually having any interest in the responsibility of care. And that feels very much of like, how could a physically inferior, physically smaller framed sex become dominant within the community by building these social ties if males try to dominate in any way, which is rare. The women's relationships that like all of the females, not the women, that all of the females will like basically come together and be like, fuck you, and he'll be really fucked. And it is this kind of like the social communal like collaboration maintains this balance. And the reason that that's valuable is that these males, though who would be considered inferior, are always fed. They don't get priority, but because they're made a community effort, or it's because there's not a restriction of resources, there's an abundance of food resources, there's no concern that they're not going to receive necessary food. So like assuming that all evolutionary progressions are kind of centered around food and reproduction. So there's not a biological concern for receiving enough resources. And that because the females are having sex all the time with lots of different members, both female and female, and because it's not possible to know when they're ovulating because they have swollen genitals for so much of the time, that they've essentially, like evolutionarily, figured out how to randomize paternity. So that none of them know which of the males is technically the sperm donor, the father, the biological father of any of the infants, or of any of the babies, any of the newborns, ever. And so because they can't figure this out, one, it's like genetically valuable that they get as long as they stay in the good graces, they have the opportunity to spread seed, that's so gross, widely, and kind of indiscriminately, and don't have the responsibility of caring for that newborn. Like humans, evolutionary response to this problem has been theoretically monogamy, or paternal involvement, which has worked however well you want to say it's worked. And so this kind of sort of circumvents this need for paternal involvement, because you have this larger community of females that is able and willing to care for each of the new females by functioning not in this sort of individualist society of nuclear families, that is a community-oriented kind of means of caring and of responsibility for youth. I'm trying to think of the good words. For little baby animals, for the babies. Because there's not this responsibility. And again, because there's an abundance of resources where all of the needs can be met, there's not a need, or there's not a reason for them to develop kind of internal conflict. If you can meet all these needs, and if everyone has equal opportunity towards reproduction. And so what that looks like in research is that that conflict is just conflict occurs. Violence is very rare. Violence to the effect that it would do actual harm on one of their own community. God, I can't remember. I think there are evidence of I think there's evidence of conflict between groups that kind of are in different habitats, that are in disconnected environments. But I can't remember if that resulted in death or the degree that that conflict went. I know that there is evidence of separate groups joining and intermingling. And part of that is that the way that they are able to avoid incest while maintaining this kind of ambiguous paternity is that it's females that leave their unit, their family unit, to go and join a different group. So it's young females. So males will stay with their mother their whole lives. They stay within their mother's community. Females will go and leave and go and make an effort to join a different community. And there's a documentary that I saw on YouTube. God, it might have been National Geographic. I think it's relatively recent. It was pretty great that shows all of this that I'm unnecessarily detailing. It's not even about the book that I just read. It's just the Bonobos rant. I just think they're so cool. They're so interesting. And that what we would identify as these bizarre cultural markers are evolutionary and biological responses. So, getting back to the book that I just read, and not the three that I read. So this book that I just finished. So we're taking all of that information. I'm taking that background. That we have these kind of diametrically opposed species that are equidistant to us evolutionarily. And so while we have regarded ourselves as our animalistic selves, our non-intellectual, our not higher powered, our not evolved selves to be like chimpanzees, for recent decades, because this is recent research, this has not been widely spread, and also part of that is because so much of their community centers around sex, that bonobos research and information has not necessarily been encouraged for distribution, and has been suppressed, which is so fascinating. So we have these two very different species that live very different cultural, social, relational lives, have these entirely different dynamics. And he's kind of considering this question of which one are we, right? Which piece of this is the truest? Which piece of this is ourselves? And I think, so much of our cultural definition of ourselves being aligned with the chimpanzee's tendencies for violence, for aggression, for domination, for patriarchal hierarchical structures, has kind of validated their existence within our human cultures and human societies, saying this is fundamentally who we are, and it serves all of these purposes. And so the existence of bonobos completely conflicts and contradicts that frame of thinking, that our humanity, or that our human urges, that the basis part of ourselves are these violent and aggressive tendencies, and that anything outside of that is the uniquely human capacity that we've developed through our superior intelligence. He's basically saying that's bullshit. That's bullshit. A little bit. It's a little bit bullshit. It's really interesting. I think that my thoughts and kind of what sticks with me in the book is summed up really well in the last chapter, which he calls the bipolar ape, which, like a lot of the language in this book, I think is a bit outdated. It could be considered politically incorrect or inappropriate. That he's dead. And it's old. I think it was written in like the early 2000s. I don't know if I said that. So I don't fault him for that. I think that the sentiments are really powerful and that the content is really effectively conveyed. And so this last chapter is kind of sort of summing up, concluding all of these different pieces. He walks it through these questions of power, how we relate to power, how we structure ourselves politically and socially within power dynamics, and the function of those power dynamics, that it is that, yeah, it's too, I can't how to synthesize and condense that. But the kind of these questions of power, these questions of sex, these different relationships to sex, these different relationships. What are the other ones? What else? War, different relationships to war, to emotions and to feelings. And that's sort of the piece that I didn't say that I think is so significant about Bonobos, is that there's all these different pieces, kind of the sexual differences, the structure of the communities and how they're different. But the most significant kind of observations that have been made are and how they relate to each other. The degrees of empathy that they have appeared to express is really extraordinary for each other, as well as for other animals, other species, for humans, for birds. He uses a lot of research studies and a lot of anecdotes, I think, really effectively, of kind of specific ape and monkey behaviors that have been observed, that have been experimented, to convey and communicate how clearly these behaviors of empathy, of compassion, of connection are fundamental, not only within bonobos, but as well as within apes, or as well as within chimps, and to some degree in some other monkeys. So he's essentially making the argument, the conclusion in this last chapter, that that we are both of these extremes. It's not that we are more like chimpanzees, that we tend towards violence or aggression exclusively. He's saying, like, this is a part of our evolutionary history. This is part of our evolution as animals and as living beings, and that there are these, that there are reasons that we progressed and advanced in this way, to be skeptical of outsiders, to be protective of our own, that we have progressed socially to live in social communities, and that it does serve us individually, it serves our individual protection, that along with that progression, while that does have capacities for hierarchy, like we see in chimpanzees, that evolution towards sociality, with the pressures, the biological, ecological, environmental, evolutionary pressures of resource restriction, of outsiders, of external predators, that there's, I guess, a certain value in our capacity, and that as humans, we have shown the capacity to reach the most extremes of that levels of violence, like war. Almost extends beyond that with a level of callousness that is almost like, seems to go, that is not uniquely human, that there is there have been observations of like war between chimpanzee communities with a level of like targeted violence that's really interesting. But so that we have the tendency and the capacities for these levels of extreme aggression, of extreme conflict, but that bonobos show, as well as chimpanzees, as well as other apes, and some monkey species, that alongside the development of those violent and aggressive tendencies are their counterparts, are these sort of complementary pieces that as social creatures we can't exist entirely isolated. It doesn't serve us to, like, in order to have external group conflict, you have to be able to maintain a kind of social balance with that in-group of community. And so while we tend to recognize on how we tend to focus on the externalizations of that aggression and that violence, we don't give enough attention to the ways that we balance that conflict with peace, that we balance that hierarchical disruption with complex social networks that maintain alliances and that maintain balance, hierarchical balance, when those conflicts aren't occurring. And that we have simply not done enough research on the ways in which the chapter on peace I found really, really extraordinary. I have a lot from that I kind of pulled and have been thinking about. But on peace and what it means to maintain peace, that it means reciprocity, the willingness to care for others, empathy, the ability to understand another's needs, another's desires, another's expectations, the ability to compromise, to give for the sake of maintaining a sense of order and a sense of peace. That all of these pieces, that our generosity, our willingness to give for that level, for that reciprocity, and that changes with social distinctions. That changes with the ways that we relate to others, how we define those others. Do we define those kind of that we communicate differently, we work differently with different individuals depending on the social relationship, and that different behaviors serve different, that the same behavior may serve a different social function depending on who that behavior is directed towards. So that, like, grooming with a mother, or with like grooming with a mother might be not very significant, but that grooming with an individual that you don't have a close social tie with does actually shift social structures and shift both of those individuals' or all of those individuals within that social hierarchy, depending on that interaction. And I think that a lot of sort of what I got out of this book as I was reading, it was a sense of kind of clarifying. It felt like it in a way, I feel this a lot of these, but I think in a way it felt almost so obvious after the fact. It was kind of like he was pointing a light on things that we kind of recognize peripherally, but that aren't given much value, that we haven't defined as particularly valuable. I think specifically in like American culture. And he does, like, as a German scientist, kind of distinguish his experience just as an individual, moving across cultures, moving across communities, recognizing the importance of distinction in culture. And that's one of the other things that he really, I think he really solidifies, and it really stuck with me, is not only that we have the capacity for both extreme levels of aggression and violence, and also, you know, more than what we see in any other ape, are these extraordinary levels of kindness and of generosity, of compassion and caring that aren't identified. And so being within these two extremes, that we kind of that we sort of disregard our capacities for empathy, because they don't, I don't know, for all of the reasons that we don't value emotions, but that positive emotional response is a fundamental piece of our humanity. That it is not superior to any other animal. It is also not like, it doesn't contradict like human evolution in our societies. It's not a weakness, and neither is it a unique strength, but that it is simply a fundamental piece of our species. It is a fundamental characteristic. It is as ingrained as each of our most violent tendencies. And recognizing that capacity always exists. And how much of how we express our capacities for violence or for generosity, for badness or goodness, is determined socially and culturally. And that's where this kind of question of culture comes in, that there's all of this evidence, not only that like different apes express different behaviors, right? That we have chimps and bonobos and us who are all so close evolutionarily that have such different cultural structures, functions, habits, tendencies, and I think he makes the argument mostly just expressions of our various tendencies, that we express these differently, that we see it in different cultures among humans, and to that extent we see it in to the same extent we see it in different cultures among apes, among different communities of chimpanzees. Will have different habits and will have different tendencies, that they see it across communities of bonobos, that they've seen it across communities of different monkeys. And he has a really, really effective piece about a species of monkey that I don't remember, that had was notoriously violent and aggressive and cruel, quite cruel, and that they did an experiment where they took a section of this monkey's population, they put them in an environment with another species. God, specifics don't stick with me. It's all the vibes. And with a different species, and that was calmer, that was far less aggressive, but that was physically larger and physically dominant. So essentially, this more kind of violent monkey species was forced, kind of lost the advantage through these violent tendencies, that they actually no longer served them because they couldn't physically outpace these other monkey species. And so after leaving them for a period of time that I also don't remember, they found that the notoriously aggressive monkeys, behaviors had changed entirely. They were resembled much more closely the behaviors of the larger, calmer monkeys, and that when moved back into their original habitat with their own species, that they retained those calmer behaviors. That a species known collectively for a very specific exhibition of an expression of violent behavior, simply by engaging with a different population, by existing with a different population with different expressions of those behaviors, with cultural differences, that they were able to internalize and practice those behaviors, that they could shift their response individually, and that they could retain those cultural differences even when returning to their individual communities. He details another not intentional experiment, but essentially an observation of another species of monkey that I don't remember the name, that is, again, notoriously aggressive, notoriously violent, that will bully others to get to a specific food source, and to prevent others within their community members from receiving that food source, that they will hoard it, and that a collection of food resources that the most aggressive, most dominant members of this population would go and get the food and not share it, and would hoard it for themselves, and was somehow poisoned, or there was something in it that killed them all off, killed off all of the most aggressive members of this population. And that in observing this community for years, I think for at least a decade over time, after this population of members died, that the culture of the community shifted much further away from those aggressive tendencies. And that within a decade, even when none of the original members at that population shift occurred were still within the community, that cultural shift of reduced aggression, of reduced conflict, of increased grooming was maintained over time. So that what we might even consider, because these are populations, these are species that we say this is what we say it for chimpanzees, this is what chimpanzees are. They are aggressive, they are violent, they are hierarchical, this is what bonobos are. They are peaceful, and they like to have sex, and they're having a good time. And that there are these monkeys, and they are known to be violent and cruel, and have lots of conflict. And we do that with humans. We say humans are inherently selfish, inherently cruel, inherently violent, and are only ever interested in serving their own purposes. And the degree to which we collaborate with others, we build social ties, we build social communities, is only to the degree that it can further serve our own purpose. That's the social Darwin perspective of how we think about humanity. And what these populations of apes and monkeys show us, and what this evidence of these two evolutionarily close ape species to ourselves, the opposition of their cultural expressions, of their cultural norms and their practices, which is, kind of what they really are, that even as we can recognize that there are certain characteristics, certain behaviors that are fundamental pieces of ourselves, all of that conflict is fundamental. But to the extent that conflict is fundamental, so is reconciliation. That with conflict there must be reconciliation. That kind of one of the ways that he expresses this is that, like, the conflict between a mother and a newborn infant that is breastfeeding is sort of the original conflict, that at some point, and that they've seen this in populations of apes, that at some point the infant will want to continue breastfeeding and the mother will no longer want to. And that ability to negotiate, to what extent, how much, how often, how frequently, when does it stop, that is a negotiation balanced by mother and infant. And that is kind of this fundamental piece of ourselves, is this ongoing shift in both needing and being dependent on another being, and not and being in conflict with that being. That just made me remember, which would get me on a whole different tangent that I'm not going to talk about, but that there's all this research on the difference between male and female conflict that gets really, really fascinating, and how it's expressed and how it's reconciled. But that, God, I lost my train of thought. What a shit show! This shit show. That to the extent that we are capable of all of this violence, and the extent to that which we are capable of all of this good, of all of the extraordinary levels of generosity and compassion that we show, that are also fundamental pieces of us, that these are working complementarily, that our that in serving ourselves, that we ensure our own longevity in caring for others with the expectation of reciprocity. That these kind of sort of two sides of the same coin, like these pieces that are intrinsically tied, both intrinsically opposed and intrinsically connected, those are the pieces that are fundamental in us. But the expression of those behaviors and the balance of those behaviors and the negotiation of each of those capacities is individually determined, but very significantly culturally determined. And that what we might consider intrinsic, innate within us may just be culturally defined and culturally normalized expressions of natural capacities for both self-preservation and generosity. That we are not necessarily exclusively inclined towards our own selfishness. That our care for others is deep-rooted. That it's not, I was listening maybe to a podcast or something, that made a joke that I've heard before, that was like, oh, it's a good thing I didn't live, in Stone Age times, and, I would have been discarded because I can't see, or whatever. Because we kind of see as that our care for others, that our community values are human designed, that we've become intellectually enlightened enough to recognize the value in caring for others, when actually there's experiments, there's observations of apes, of monkeys caring for those in their community that are sick, that are disabled, that are blind, that do not have limbs, that they're and even when, and then you can, there's, this is where he's kind of like, there's not enough research in this field, is that what that looks like evolutionarily, where it is now that it is practiced to the extent that reciprocal expectation is not, or that reciprocity is no longer the expectation, that caring is simply the act of caring for caring's sake, a feeling of responsibility towards others in our community, that level of empathy cannot be logically determined or logically defined as, even though it may have evolutionarily, and it likely evolutionarily developed with this kind of flipped point of that in helping others we help ourselves, but that is now carried out in practice to the extent that reciprocation is not necessarily expected or guaranteed, and that maybe that comes from in building community relationships, that we, and in developing and in having empathy that is seen in these apes and in monkeys and in bonobos, really specifically, that this empathy has given us the capacity to see ourselves, that the ability to see ourselves in others and see others in ourselves gives us the ability to care for others, in knowing that it's the golden rule: do for others as you would want them to do unto you. Like, this is what we consider this kind of moral standing might just be a fundamental characteristic of being alive, of being an ape, that it may not be uniquely human, that it is actually fundamental within us, and that it's very illogic, that it's that emotional tie is a means of communication and is a means of understanding that isn't in conflict with our intelligence, but that actually extends the I don't want to say value, but that kind of expands what it means. I think it expands our capacities. I think it's the combination of our intelligence with our capacity, our innate capacity for compassion and for empathy, that allows us to express and practice means of generosity and connection and social responsibility to such extremes. And it is sort of this question of, like, how do we, knowing that this piece of ourselves is as fundamental, is not more likely, that it's not a hierarchical standing, it's not refuting the fact that violence is an innate component of our biology and of our evolution, but that tangentially our generosity, our kindness, our empathy, our compassion, our social responsibility exists just as profoundly and innately. And it's a question of how do we as humans continue to recognize that the conflicts that arise from these kind of biological responses of fear, of aggression, of distrust. How do we recognize that while making an effort to expand our definition, I think, of an in-group? And I think that's this piece of it, that our levels of and it's also a willingness, I think, in some ways to give up certain pieces of individual power, right? That's what socialism is. It's to give up components of individual power in order to kind of work towards a community effort. And he does also like say, he's like, look, that to an extreme will not work either, because we cannot move towards our efforts of kind of egalitarianism, of community care, social responsibility, by disregarding the importance and kind of critical core of our selfish desire for preservation, for our own protection, and for the protection of, even within an in-group, the in of the in-group. It's like familial ties, that those kind of that can have such a impact on our expressions of behavior. And so I think it's kind of this question of how do we expand our definition of community and of in-group, and without devaluing our individual interests, without diminishing the importance of an individual power and autonomy. How do we simultaneously work towards a sort of more expansive definition of empathy and compassion, and of care and reconciliation, with a willingness to identify within that the characteristic, I think, fear and distrust, anger, that drives those kind of more violent expressions of these kinds of innate characteristics. I think I've been talking too long. I think the high has worn off. I've been talking too long. I haven't drank water. I've lost my train of thought about 18 times. I don't know if anything I said was good. I think I spent the first 20 minutes just talking about bonobos. Like, bitch, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing here? We're closing the year with an hour of talking about apes. I had to do it though. I had to. It wasn't going to leave my brain. Like, goddamn. It wasn't. It wasn't. I still think about it all the time. I might do it again. Like, I'm almost getting a second wind, and I'm like, bitch, maybe I will talk about how males have a tendency to, like, fight and be in conflict and then to reconcile, but they have, their social ties are much weaker, whereas females are much more likely to, like, subvert and to be subversive in their conflicts, and to be indirect, and that when a conflict does occur, much less likely to reconcile, and that often those ties, those social and relational ties, and those bonds are much stronger, and so when they break, it's much more significant. It's much harder to reconcile. Like, they see this, but again, like, culturally constructed. So we, using our intelligence, if we're going to do anything, how do we know that there are all essential? Look at the possibilities. The possibilities are endless. The ways that we choose to balance aggression in community and individual interests with community efforts, and that there is no one. There is simply not one way. There just isn't. There are a million. There are endless. There are endless ways that we can choose to live together. And we get choosing different. We gotta choose differently. We gotta make better choices. We gotta make different choices. It's not inevitable. We don't have to hurt each other. We are gonna get pissed off, but we can do something. What are we gonna do? Happy New Year, bitch.